and welcome back to another episode of the Lord of the Rings AMA podcast. My name is Matthias Austin, and on this podcast, I invite you to ask me anything about Lord of the Rings, The Hobbit, or anything related to the greater legendarium of J.R.R. Tolkien, and I will do my best to give you as in-depth an answer as I can. And if you want to submit a question, you can email me at lotramapod@gmail.com, just like this week's question asker, Dacia from Warrenville, Illinois. Dacia asks, how did the sun come to be? What is the story of the Two Trees of Light? Well, thank you, Dacia, for those questions. She actually asked me several more questions about the origin of various other things in Middle-earth, but I may save some of those for the next mailbag episode. Now, Dacia, I'm also going to swap the order of your questions, because in the grand scheme of the world of Arda, the world that Middle-earth is in, the sun was actually one of the last things that came to be. Though this is, once again, one of those elements of Tolkien's work that he couldn't quite settle on, which we'll get into later on in the episode. For now, I'm going to stick to the most commonly agreed upon version of events, and I'm going to start with a little bit of a review of one of our earliest episodes, What is the Creation Mythology of Middle-earth? Well, here's a quick recap of episode 3, that episode. The episode that actually, according to the analytics I can see, is the least listened episode of the podcast, which is a shame because so much of the lore that I constantly refer back to can be found there. But, so very basically, the world was created by the Valar, which is basically like a Greek pantheon-esque group of angelic beings who were given the responsibility of making and watching over the world, which was called Arda, by Eru Ilúvatar, the monotheistic god of this universe. And there were 14 Valar, 7 male, 7 female, and then one extra guy who was named Melkor, later he's called Morgoth, who, while being of the same, the type of thing, he was the same type of thing as the Valar, he was not dedicated to the betterment of the world. In fact, he sought to control Arda, and barring that, destroy it. And so the primordial world of Arda was formed by this conflict between Melkor and the Valar. And eventually, Melkor was driven out of Arda, and that allowed the Valar to finish their work. Though, thanks to Melkor's meddling, it didn't match what their original plan was. And the world they created was a roughly symmetrical flat disk, with land on the west, land on the east, and a larger landmass in the center. And in the middle of this land was a large lake, and in the center of that was the island of Almaran, where the Valar lived. And in order to light the world, they built 2 great pillars, one in the extreme north, one in the extreme south, that shed light over the whole world, and there was no night or darkness. And for a time, things were peaceful, and plants and animals were created and began to grow. But Melkor, in secret, came back to Arda, and with his Balrogs and other spirits loyal to him, he attacked the pillars. And they toppled over, and the fire of their destruction covered much of the world. And there were earthquakes, and the large landmass splintered into continents, and Arda, the world, was covered in darkness. The Valar were able to salvage much of creation, but in the darkness, many of the plants and the animals were placed in a state of hibernation. And Melkor set up a fortress in the frozen north of the world, basically in the center of all of those lands that would later be known as Middle-earth. And the Valar knew that direct confrontation with him would only cause more damage to this fragile world, and so they feared that causing any more harm could hurt the unawakened elves and men, which they knew were going to wake up somewhere in the world, but they didn't know where. So the Valar withdrew to that land in the far west, which was called Aman, which basically translated to Blessed Land. But it was also called Valinor, the land of the Valar. And in order to protect this land, the Vala Aule, the smith, created a huge mountain range on the shore of the land facing Middle-earth. These were called the Pelori Mountains. And so at this point, the only light in Arda came either from the fires of Melkor or from the stars that had been created by the queen of the Vala, Varda. And so on a green hill outside of Valmar, the city of the Valar, the Vala Yavanna, that's a lot of V's sounds I just realized. Green hill outside of Valmar, the city of the Valar, the Vala Yavanna. Anyway, Yavanna was the wife of Aule the Smith and the creator of all of the plants of Arda. And she began to sing a song. And here's how it's described in the Silmarillion. And when Valinor was full wrought, and the mansions of the Valar were established, in the midst of the plain beyond the mountains they built their city, Valmar of many bells. Before its western gate there was a green mound, Ezelohar, and Yavanna hallowed it, and she sat there long upon the green grass, and sang a song of power, in which was set all her thought of things that grow in the earth. But Nienna, who's another Vala, thought in silence, and watered the mound with her tears. In that time the Valar were gathered together to hear the song of Yavanna, and they sat silent upon their thrones of council in the Mahanexar, the ring of doom near the golden gates of Valmar. And Yavanna sang before them, and they watched. And as they watched, upon the mound there came forth 2 slender shoots, and silence was over all the world in that hour, nor was there any other sound save the chanting of Yavanna. Under her song the saplings grew and became fair and tall, and came to flower, and thus there awoke in the world the 2 trees of Valinor. Of all things which Yavanna made, they have most renown, and about their fate all the tales of the elder days are woven. Now, as most things in Tolkien's work do, these trees had names, and the one that blossomed first was named Telperion, with the root telper, meaning silver. It had dark green leaves that were silver on the underside, and it was covered in countless silver flowers, which gave off a soft light. The other tree was called Lorelin, which means Song of Gold. Its leaves were a lighter green with golden edges, and its flowers were golden and radiated warmth and light. Now Telperion, as I mentioned, blossomed first, and the silver light filled Valinor, though it didn't pass the Pelori Mountains. And the light waxed and then it waned, and as it waned, Lorelin began to blossom. And there was a period when both trees shone at the same time, and then Telperion would go dark while Lorelin reached its full brightness, and that cycle of waxing and waning would repeat. And the Silmarillion tells us that this was the first method ever used in history to record time. And the light from the trees was essentially a liquid, because we're told that the dew of the trees and the light of them could be saved, and the Vala Varda could keep them in like great vats. You would have these great vats, the wells of Varda, that was filled with the dew of these trees, and then eventually the water would go up in the air and there would be light. Now, we are never told the size of these trees, but for their light to be able to fill all of Valinor, an entire continent, means that they would have had to have been truly, truly massive. But then again, we're also never told how large the Valar were in their physical forms. So it could be that to the Valar, they were normal-sized large trees, and regular trees like came up to the Valar's knees or something. Who knows? We're never really given that perspective. But the main point is that the light of the 2 trees bathed the land of the Valar in eternal light, sometimes softer, sometimes brighter, while the only light in Middle-earth was the starlight of Varda. Now I'm going to do a little detour here before coming back to the story of the trees, because while all of this seems far off and mythical, there is a direct connection from these trees to the Lord of the Rings. The fruit of the silver tree Telperion was given to the elves when they arrived in Valinor, and it produced a sapling named Galathilion, identical to Telperion, except that it didn't give off light. And this fruit was planted, and it grew in the city of Tirion in Valinor. And the fruit of Galathilion, that tree, was planted on the island of Tol Eressëa, an island just off the coast of Valinor, where many of the elves lived, and it kind of acted as a landing zone for newcomers to Valinor. In fact, it's likely that when Frodo went away, when he sailed away at the end of The Lord of the Rings, he probably didn't go to Valinor. He probably stayed on Tall Eressëa. And the name of the tree on that island was Celeborn, which, yes, is the same name as Galadriel's husband, which just means silver tree in Sindarin. And when the Edain, those men who fought for the Valar, when they were given the land of Numenor at the end of the First Age, elves from Tol Eressëa brought the fruit of Celeborn as a gift, and the tree that grew in Numenor was called Nimloth, which means white flower. Now here's where the naming of the trees stops, but the trees themselves don't. Because when the Númenóreans turned away from the Valar, and Sauron was among them, influencing them to leave the Valar, it was ordered that the tree of Nimloth should be destroyed. And a very young Isildur risked his life to break into the castle and steal a fruit which he planted in secret, and that sapling was taken with him when they fled the destruction of Númenor. It was planted in Gondor and became a symbol of the royal house. And there's a couple more saplings in Gondor from the various trees, but the end result is that the white tree that we see in Lord of the Rings is a direct descendant of Telperion, the eldest of the Two Trees of Valinor. And this is, again, one of those details that would have been entirely unknown to the readers of Lord of the Rings, but the way it's talked about in Return of the King definitely hints that there's something really important behind that tree. Now, jumping back to before the time of the sun, we have a world half in darkness, half in light. And in the darkness, beneath the stars, the elves awoke. And I'm not going to get into everything that happened with the elves. For that, I'm going to direct you to Episode 6, the Elven Explanation Extravaganza episode, a title I regret more and more every time I reference it. But to summarize it, Melkor gets captured and imprisoned by the Valar, and many but not all of the elves make their way to Valinor. And in Valinor was born Feanor, Prince of the Noldor, and he was the greatest smith that ever existed in the world. Some say he's actually the greatest elf that ever existed. And he was enamored with the light of the trees. And it's possible that maybe he had some foresight that they wouldn't last forever, and he wanted to find a way to capture their light. And in one of the unfinished tales, Tolkien describes how this idea may have come from Galadriel, and specifically, her golden hair. This is what he writes about Galadriel's hair. It was golden like the hair of her father and her foremother Indis, but richer and more radiant, for its gold was touched by some memory of the star-like silver of her mother. And the Eldar said that the light of the two trees, Laurelin and Telperion, had been snared in her tresses. Many thought that this saying first gave to Feanor the thought of imprisoning and blending the light of the trees that later took shape in the hands of the Silmarils. For Feanor beheld the hair of Galadriel with wonder and delight. He begged 3 times for a tress, but Galadriel would not give him even one hair. These two kinsfolk, the greatest of the Eldar of Valinor, were unfriends forever. Just as a reminder, Feanor was Galadriel's half-uncle, creepily asking her for her hair. But this story shines a light, pun intended, on the significance of Gimli requesting 1 hair and receiving 3. And any of the elves that knew that story of Feanor, something I would bet a lot of money on that Gimli didn't know, would have been shocked by his audacity in asking for 1 hair, and even more shocked when Galadriel gave Gimli what she denied the greatest elf to ever live, 3. Anyway, after Galadriel said no to her hair being taken by her creepy uncle, he made the greatest creation ever made by non-Valar hands, the Silmarils. This is how they're described in the Silmarillion. As 3 great jewels they were in form, but not until the end, when Feanor shall return, who perished ere the sun was made, and sits now in the halls of awaiting, and comes no more among his kin. Not until the sun passes and the moon falls shall it be known of what substance they were made. Like the crystal of diamonds it appeared, and yet was more strong than adamant, so that no violence could mar it or break it within the kingdom of Arda. Yet that crystal was to the Silmarils, but as is the body to the children of Ilúvatar, the house of its inner fire, that is within it and yet in all parts of it, and is its life. And the inner fire of the Silmarils Fëanor made of the blended light of the trees of Valinor, which lives in them yet, though the trees have long withered and shine no more. Therefore even in the darkness of the deepest treasury, the Silmarils of their own radiance shone like the stars of Varda, and yet, as were they indeed living things, they rejoiced in light and received it and gave it back in hues more marvelous than before. As that passage hints at, it's probably pretty good that they were made because the time of the trees was nearing its end. Melkor was eventually released from captivity, claiming that he was reformed and wanted to do good, which of course was a lie. He hated the elves, and he especially hated Fëanor, who never trusted him. And he tried to manipulate Fëanor into disturbing the peace of Valinor by claiming that, the Valar were jealous of him and might one day come to take away the Silmarils. And Fëanor laughed in his face and he slammed his door, which really, really made Melkor furious. And he made it his mission to ruin Fëanor's life, stirring up trouble and discontent between Fëanor and his half-brothers, Fingolfin and Finarfin, with half-truths and full lies, which did lead to Fëanor creating the first weapons in Valinor, and eventually threatening to kill Fingolfin. For this, Fëanor was basically placed under house arrest for a year, but the Valar wanted to figure out where all of this bad feeling, where all this stuff came from, and eventually the trail led back to Melkor. At this point, he fled far to the south of Aman, and he secretly crossed the Pelori Mountains, and he hid from the Valar. And in the south, there was this small stretch of land between the Pelori and the seas called Avathar. And because of its location, with the right up against the mountains where the light wasn't hitting, it was one of the darkest places in all of Arda. And there he met Ungoliant, the giant spider. Now, who she was and how she got there is a mystery, one of those unsolved bits of Tolkien lore. But she was evil, and she was hungry, and she hated the light. Now, at this point, Melkor had two goals: escape back to Middle-earth, where Sauron and his other minions were, and 2, steal the Silmarils. But with the land of Valinor being covered in eternal light, he knew it would be nearly impossible to do that unseen. But Ungoliant had the ability to weave darkness around her, and he promised her that if she helped him, he would give her the purest light to eat and fill the world with darkness. So together, they crept back into Valinor, and from a distance they resembled like a dark cloud on the horizon. But no one noticed them, as all of the Valar and the elves were celebrating a festival, at which Fëanor was allowed to finally return and make peace with his brothers. Here's what happens next, as described in the Silmarillion. It is told that even as Fëanor and Fingolfin stood before Manwë, there came the mingling of the lights, when both trees were shining, and the silent city of Valmar was filled with the radiance of silver and gold. And in that very hour, Melkor and Ungoliant came hastening over the fields of Valinor, as the shadow of a black cloud upon the wind fleets over the sunlit earth, and they came before the green mound Azelahar. Then the unlight of Ungoliant rose up even to the roots of the trees, and Melkor sprang upon the mound, and with his black spear he smote each tree to its core, wounded them deep, and their sap ruptured forth as if it were their blood, and was spilled upon the ground. But Ungoliant drank it, and going then from tree to tree, she set her black beak to their wounds, till they were drained, and the poison of death that was in her went into their tissues, and withered them root, branch, and leaf, and they died. And still she thirsted, and going to the wells of Varda, she drank them dry. But Ungoliant belched forth black vapors as she drank, and swelled to a shape so vast and hideous that Melkor was afraid. And at this the Valar and the elves, they were dismayed, but there was still some hope for the trees. While Yavanna said that they were her greatest work and she would never be able to make anything like them again, she believed that if the Silmarils were to be broken open, the light they contained could heal the trees and return them to life. And so the Valar asked Fëanor if he would give them up, so that the world would have light again. But Feanor loved the Silmarils, and he responded to the Valar this way. For the less, even as for the greater, there is some deed that he may accomplish but once only, and in that deed his heart shall rest. It may be that I can unlock my jewels, but never again shall I make their like, and if I must break them, I shall break my heart, and I shall be slain. It seemed to him that he was beset in a ring of enemies, and the words of Melkor returned to him, saying that the Silmarils were not safe, if the Valar would possess them. And is he not Vala as they are? Said his thought. And does he not understand their hearts? Yea, a thief shall reveal thieves. Then he cried aloud, This thing I will not do of free will. But if the Valar will constrain me, then shall I know indeed that Melkor is of their kindred. But the Valar were not like Melkor, and they would not use force to make Feanor give up the Silmarils. But much of that whole discussion was a moot point anyway, because with the world again plunged into darkness, Melkor and Ungoliant were able to flee unseen, but they stopped at Formenos, that city where Feanor was keeping the Silmarils. And they slew Feanor's father, King Finwë, stole the Silmarils, and escaped back to Middle-earth. And the Noldor would follow him against the will of the Valar, and this would lead to pretty much everything else that happens in the history of Middle-earth. So I'm going to leave the Silmarils there for now, because we're talking about the trees, and the moon, and the sun. While the Noldor and Melkor left, the Valar sat, communing with one another in thought. Manwë urged Yavanna and Nienna to try to heal the trees, but all of Nienna's tears and all that Yavanna's song could accomplish was that Telperion produced one last silver flower, and Lorelin produced one last golden fruit. And they were given to Aule, and he used his craft to transform them into vessels that preserved their light. And not wanting to abandon the elves that were in Middle-earth now that Melkor had returned, they placed them in vessels that would sail through the skies and give light to the world. The flower of Telperion was turned into the moon, called Isil the Sheen, and the fruit became the sun, called Anar the Fire Golden. For each one of the Maya, sub-angelic categories underneath the Valar. There's like the Valar, and underneath them are the Maiar. And for each one of those, a Maya was chosen to pilot them through the skies, much like Eärendil from last week's episode. Now, Isil, the moon, was piloted by Tilion, one of the hunters of Orome. And he was chosen because he had spent most of his time that he wasn't hunting resting beneath Telperion, and he loved silver. When he first flew Isil through the sky, Melkor sent spirits of shadows to attack him, because he hated the light. But Tilion was able to fight them off, but the scars of that battle remained on Isil forever after. I'm also going to note here that when the moon first rose, it coincided with Fingolfin unfurling his banners in Middle-earth for the first time, declaring that they were there to defeat Melkor. And the Maya that was chosen to pilot Anar was a spirit of fire, one of the few fire spirits that Melkor was unable to corrupt, named Arien. And her job in Valinor had been to tend the flowers of Lorelin and water the tree with the dew that fell from Telperion. It's like one tree watered the other tree, and her job was to take that dew and water Lorelin. And the Silmarillion tells us that she was one of the few who could withstand the heat of Lorelin, and that when she shed her body, her spirit was a fierce flame, and none could look at her. And when Arien arose with Anar, Melkor fled to the deepest pits of his fortress and hid in the dark out of fear of her. And when she first arose, that was the moment that men first awoke far away in the east of Middle-earth. So the rising of both the sun and moon were these indicators of massive historical shifts happening in Arda. And at first, since Valinor was in the west of the world, both sunrise and moonrise were in the west. They would go up and they would go back down there. And the rising light served as a guide to men as they began migrating west towards it. Only later did the Valar figure out what the plan would be with them, and so they built this tunnel that went underneath the earth that would take Isil and Anar from Valinor to the far east, creating the normal cycle of the sun and moon, rising in the east and settling in the west, and then they'd go underground, pop up the other side, east to west again. And they were never meant to be in the sky at the same time, but Tilion, flying Isil, was obsessed with Arian. He was super into her, and he kept trying to catch up to her. And so sometimes the sun and moon would be out at the same time, and sometimes Tilion would just vanish from the night sky. Now, as for the two trees, they were left standing, their bare limbs serving as a memorial to the glory that they had once been. And just imagine how bright they must have been if just one flower and one fruit became the sun and the moon. So while the rest of Arda was seeing daylight for the first time, for those living in Valinor, the world was much dimmer than it had been. But the elves don't believe that the trees will remain dead forever. They believe that after Melkor is finally defeated forever, at the end of time, and the world will be remade, the Silmarils will be gathered together, and Feanor himself will finally deliver them to the Valar, and they will be broken open and used to bring life back to the trees, and the Pelori Mountains will be leveled, and the light of Telperion and Lorelin would shine all over Arda. And it's interesting to note that even though the trees weren't the first idea of the Valar, which remember were those two pillars, it seems that they were an improvement. They were the best idea. And it shows that some good came out of that evil that Melkor did. And that fits pretty strongly into Elvish and, honestly, Tolkien's Catholic theology as the idea that Ilúvatar can bring good out of evil. And that was the central tenet to the whole creation mythology of the elves. Now that could be where we end this episode, since all of this came from the Silmarillion and is the core text for everything related to the first age of Middle-earth. And Christopher Tolkien, he based it on the most complete stories that J.R.R., his father, had made of his legendarium. The trouble is that Tolkien never stopped tinkering with his work as he tried to figure out the lore. In the History of Middle-earth, Volume 10, Morgoth's Ring, there is a chapter called Myths Transformed, which is full of Tolkien's later writings that directly contradicted things he had written before. We talked a little bit about this in our episode on orcs, or orcs with a K, as Tolkien wanted to change the spelling to. In it, he goes into great detail into all the problems he has with what he had previously written. And for instance, much of the mythology with the trees and the sun and the moon, they were centered around this idea of a flat Earth that would eventually be turned into a round one after the fall of Númenor. But sometime after 1958, which was 3 years after Return of the King came out, and Return of the King was based off of his original lore that canonically came from an Elvish perspective, in 1958 he wrote, "It is now clear to me that in any case the mythology must actually be a mannish affair, as opposed to Elvish. The High Eldar living and being tutored by demiurgic beings," I had to look that word up, basically the beings that made the world, the Valar. "The elves being tutored by them, they must have known the truth. The truth in this case being that the world is a sphere, and we're in a solar system. It's only these backwards humans with primitive beliefs that actually believe that, as he said, the astronomically absurd business of the making of the sun and moon." And he also thought that Arda should be thought of like Earth, one planet of many, and that the Valar only had dominion over that one thing, not all of the universe, which would mean that Varda wouldn't have been the one to have made all of the stars. That would have been Ilúvatar, which sort of robbed her of her purpose, and the sun would have had to have been there from the beginning, but Melkor would initially be able to, kind of affect it a little bit, and the moon was created by the Valar, but all of that would have happened before the two trees, and basically he just wanted to redo all of the things he wrote. And the role of the trees itself, they changed from something of pure goodness and light to one of almost selfishness, because he said, well, what if the trees are the thing that makes Valinor a land for immortals, and it stops the natural processes of the world? And it gets more complicated from there, and honestly, it became really hard for me to follow. He got into a thing called the Dome of Varda that mirrored the sky or something. It's strange. And some of those later writings get really graphically dark. For instance, in some versions, Tolkien wrote that Melkor wasn't just unable to convince Arwen to join him, he actually desired her for his wife, and she rejected him, at which point he assaults her, The term Tolkien uses is ravished, and her power flares up and burns his skin, making him lose his fair form, and he forever looks burned afterwards. And I'm not at all a fan of that being used as a plot point. Looking at you, George R. R. Martin, and tonally, it doesn't really fit with anything else he had written. That level of that specific type of evilness, with one tiny exception during the story of Beren and Luthien, which also related to Melkor. But I'm glad he didn't turn that into a more developed story. And I'm hoping to have someone come on the show soon, because a specific person, I won't, just in case it doesn't happen, I'm not going to say who it is, but somebody who's kind of a big name in the world of online Tolkien discourse, because I really want to talk about, like, what should and shouldn't be considered canon in the world of Middle-earth. Because the more reading I do of, the history of Middle-earth, the less sure I am that I'm telling you guys all the right thing. So for now, I'm going to leave it at this. The most complete version, and the stuff that was in Tolkien's mind when he wrote Lord of the Rings, is everything I initially told you. And all of that comes directly from the Silmarillion. I can't imagine how Christopher managed to sift through all of these contradicting versions of stories, and he somehow came up with a coherent narrative, but I'm glad he did. Well, there you go, Dacia. I hope that answers your questions about the two trees and the making of the sun and moon. And like I said up top, some of your other questions I'm going to save until our next mailbag episode. And if you, like Dacia, would like to submit a question, whether a full-length one or a shorter one for the mailbag episodes, you can email in to lotramapod@gmail.com. I did enjoy doing the This Week in Middle-earth segment last week, and I'm open to ideas for other segments as well. So you can email those if you don't have a question. Suggestions of other things we could do in the show. Don't forget to leave a 5-star review. Be sure to tell a friend about the show. Honestly, that is the best way for this to grow, is just telling people you know that, hey, I found a show I like. And if you have any contacts with Lord of the Rings or Tolkien-adjacent people, let me know. I really want to start getting guests on the show to talk about things that I maybe can't find in my research, or that would have a different perspective on things. Make sure you follow me on all of the socials, Instagram, Blue Sky, Threads, YouTube. Links for all of that is below. Thank you, as always, to Michael for our music and Lauren for our artwork. And that's all for this week. Iluvatar willing, I'll be back next week. See you then.